Conservation strategies can focus on landscapes or ecosystems or regions, but conservation strategies can also focus on single species. And there are several different ways that you can pick a species that you might want to concentrate your efforts on. Now, the reason that you might do a single species is that you really can focus your efforts. So you can focus your efforts on one particular organism. And the benefit of that is that it usually has a ripple effect and will affect other species, potentially the larger community and ecosystem, as a secondary effect of working on those conservation species. So there are several different single species approaches to conservation. One is looking at and conserving indicator species. We'll also talk about umbrella species, flagship species, and keystone species. So some of these are going to sound a little bit similar, and the approach might actually be a little bit similar, but they all differ just a little bit. So an indicator species is a species whose status can indicate the overall health of an ecosystem. So they might be a particularly vulnerable species, so they might be the first one to be affected when health of the ecosystem starts to deteriorate. And so for this, if you focus on your indicator species, you can very easily monitor how your efforts in that environment are affecting that species. So two examples here. Corals. Corals are good indicators of a lot of water quality issues because they very quickly react to changes in water quality. They are a good indicator of siltation, which is deposition of sand or dirt into an environment. Usually this is sort of runoff sand or dirt or washed down out of the area surrounding the region with the corals. Polar bears are a good indicator for global climate change. We talked about some of the indicators of climate change. One of those indicators is reduction in ice at the poles. So this could be glaciers, this could be permanent ice, it could be floating ice. And polar bears are particularly susceptible because their hunting and their food gathering depends on that ice. They roam around on frozen areas in the Arctic, and they need ice flows. They need solid ice because their primary food source are aquatic mammals. And so they need ice to be able to access the areas where those aquatic mammals are. And so we can use the reduction in the polar bear habitat to indicate to us how much of an impact global warming is having on them. An umbrella species is a species whose protection by default protects other species as well. So by determining an umbrella species in an environment, you can use the efforts that are directed specifically at this organism to affect your conservation of a greater community. So for example, the northern spotted owl, or a mating pair of northern spotted owls, needs about 800 hectares of old growth forest for their hunting, for their food, for their nesting locations, for reproduction. 800 hectares is a pretty solid chunk of land. And so if you're focusing your efforts on conserving an area that is known as northern spotted owl habitat, you are also concentrating efforts in an area where you're going to affect a wide range of other organisms. So this might be other trees, and when you protect the trees, you protect the habitats, and when you protect habitats in trees, you protect other birds and you protect insects, and these are all the animals that are going to be our pollinators. And so protecting that northern owl would have a ripple effect on other species in that area. A flagship species is a single large or easily recognizable species. So these are the animals that are going to win the popularity contest. These are the ones that everybody knows are endangered. Everybody loves them. Maybe they are a symbol of the American West, or they are absolutely adorable roly-poly giant raccoons, or maybe they are majestic, big, beautiful cats. So these are animals that are going to attract attention, and they are easy to use for public support because people are already rallied behind them. And so if you can get people on board with supporting these popular animals, they are by default going to be supporting the lesser known animals in their region. And then also these large animals tend to also potentially be higher in the hierarchy of consumers, and so many of them are going to be higher level consumers, or they're going to be animals who have historically had a big impact, and so for a long time they've been very popular. Next, we have keystone species. So many of these other organisms that we've talked about would actually fall into a keystone species category. A keystone species is a species in a community that has a particularly crucial role. Now, these are not always the dominant species. They're not necessarily the big predators. They can be something small, relatively unknown to the outside world. But with keystone species, they have an impact that goes past just the food chain that they're in. Keystone species will often have such an important impact that they can actually affect the entire ecosystem. So above community level, they can affect the physical landscape. So a couple of examples here. The first one is not listed. Wolves in Yellowstone are considered a keystone species. And down in the bottom, there is a video link called How Wolves Change Rivers. You won't be able to click the link in the video, but if you go into our Brightspace module for this chapter, you will find a link to that. You can also YouTube How Wolves Change Rivers. You'll find it. Basically, the idea here is that wolves were released back into Yellowstone National Park in the 1990s after they had been extinct from that area for 40, 50 years. And ecologists watched them for the better part of 20 years, and they noticed that, of course, they had an effect on their immediate prey, so the elk and the deer. But there was a larger effect in controlling that deer population affected the grasslands, it affected the plants, and then having native plants come back into the area, it affected erosion and ultimately led to changing the course or the flow of some of the rivers in the area. So even though those wolves, which you might think of as being important as a top predator, even though their role as a top predator is important, it was far more important than anybody thought that it was. Beavers are another example of a keystone species. Beavers are a really common example, and they're considered a keystone species because their dams can change the course of rivers, can change the course of streams. They can build ponds where there were not ponds before, divert water into areas where there wasn't water before. And so by building their dams, they can physically alter the landscape. Another example here, palm nuts and figs. They produce fruits at off times, so they are important fruits when other fruits are in their dormant season. Down at the bottom, there's also a link for how beavers engineer the land. That's a little bit more information on beavers. There's a third video not listed here called something along the lines of how whales change the climate. And it's another one that talks about whale, I believe it's the blue whale, but I could be mistaken, actually affects the atmosphere. So that's interesting as well. None of these are required, but it would be really helpful for you to watch one because if we're doing this lecture in class, I show this in class. So if you've missed it, I would suggest watching one so you can get an idea of keystone species. So we've talked about conservation efforts, whether that is sort of ecosystem conservation or species conservation. But along with that, there's got to be usually some sort of habitat restoration, some physical work for repairing the habitat. And maybe it's planting native trees or planting native flowers or releasing animals, something along the lines to actually perform that conservation, perform the restoration. So humans degrade habitats all the time, but we can also help restore them. And truthful or faithful restoration of a habitat comes from knowing the native animals in those areas, comes from knowing what the extent of the damage is, what the habitat is like naturally, what invasive species are there. And then we can work to repair or replace these habitats that have been degraded. So you can kind of do habitat restoration on any level. The main ones are to restore, rehab, or replace, depending on the severity of the human degraded habitat. So there are three different ways you can approach habitat restoration. One is to do a complete restoration. So this one is going to be basically attempting to remove all traces of human impact and put that landscape back to exactly what it was before. This may or may not be possible depending on the length of time that the degradation has been occurring or to the extent that it has been occurring, but that is a possibility. Habitat restoration is sort of a partial restoration. It is just any level below complete restoration. So it's trying to get the habitat as closely restored to the original as possible. Habitat replacement is something that happens when maybe the environment is so degraded that it's not going to be able to support the original habitat. So this is going to be where we basically get a completely different ecosystem. So for example, if you have mining in a particular area, maybe the area is no longer healthy, maybe it's contaminated and the trees don't come back, but instead it's replaced by grasslands. So it's an attempt to restore it in sort of some sort of semblance of a natural or native way. But often it is so different from the original that you get completely different plant life, which means you get completely different animal life. Sometimes our restoration is animal restoration. So we may reintroduce animals to an area. Again, I talked about the wolves up in Yellowstone. Again, you can watch that video if that's something you're interested in. The video doesn't talk about the actual reintroduction, just the effects, but there is information on wolf reintroduction. And then in order to reintroduce, you need animals. So these may be animals that have been rescued or trapped for maybe they're being a nuisance or out of place or something. And sometimes we have to breed them in captivity to increase their population. And so captive breeding is basically just breeding animals outside of their natural habitat and with the intent of releasing them into the wild. So this might happen at a rehab facility. It might happen at probably not a zoo. Usually zoos are for animals that can't be released into the wild, but you can do this with pretty much anything that you can keep alive in captivity. Of course, you do need breeding pairs if you are trying to increase the population number. But there's a couple of examples here. Instead of reading them to you, I will just let you write them down. Peregrine falcon are an example of a successful reintroduction through captive breeding. And then California condors also are a group of birds that were almost lost to extinction, but there has been some successful captive breeding in California. Sometimes we need drastic measures to reintroduce or even just to keep a species going. And so sometimes we have to resort to genetic cloning. This is basically where you take the genetic material of one animal, put it into an egg of a surrogate animal, something that is similar in shape, size, and type, so that that animal can birth the clone. So example here in 2003, a banteng, which is this cow-like organism, was cloned and kept at the San Diego Zoo. So in order to do this, they would have probably used like a regular cow, something that is similar to the size of the original parent. The problem with this is you're not going to get large numbers from cloning. You might get a couple of, you might get a couple of animals, but you won't necessarily get a lot of them.